Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something uh, really significant that's unfolding right now. The trade relationship between the European Union and the United States.
Yeah, it definitely feels like things are shifting.
It feels like we're at a real inflection point, especially with the EU trade chief meeting with U.S. officials just this morning, April 14th, 2025.
Right, and that comes straight after President Trump's renewed push for the EU to negotiate a new trade deal.
Exactly. And what makes this so compelling, and frankly a bit, nerve-wracking, is this push for new deals happening right alongside the very real presence and threat of tariffs. This isn't just a story for Brussels and Washington. Its impact will ripple across the global economy and, let's be clear, will probably affect you, our listener, in your daily life.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating and maybe a bit concerning is this real tug of war. You've got the long-held belief in open trade on one side, and then this powerful resurgence of, well, protectionist ideas on the other. The current pause in tariffs from both sides, it offers a chance for dialogue, sure.
But it's just a pause.
Exactly. As you said, the fundamental disagreements that led to those tariffs in the first place, they haven't just, vanished. And you're spot on. Any major shift in this EU or U.S. trade landscape, the consequences will be felt far beyond the corridors of power.
Right. So to really get a handle on what's going on, we've dived into a range of expert analysis. We've looked at stuff from CPR, Watch Your Guru, ECCO, Institute Jacques Delors, CSIS, DHL Logistics of Things, the European Union itself, and even Business Matters.
Quite a stack.
Definitely. So our mission for you today is basically to cut through all the complexity. We want to really understand the core drivers of this situation, what the potential outcomes might be, and ultimately what it all signifies in the bigger picture.
Sounds good.
Okay, so maybe let's start by looking back a bit. This isn't the first time the EU and the US have had trade friction, right?
Indeed. No, it's really crucial to remember this isn't completely new territory. That DHL timeline reminds us of the tensions back in 2018, remember?
Steel and aluminum tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the whole long-standing saga of Airbus versus Boeing, both sides accusing each other of unfair government subsidies for years.
Right. So those past disputes, they kind of set the stage, even if today feels a bit different.
They serve as a reminder, definitely, that disagreements between these huge economic powers aren't unusual.
Okay.
The current circumstances just have their own unique flavor, let's say.
Okay. So if we fast forward to today, President Trump's overall approach to trade seems pretty central to understanding where things might go. That analysis from the Institute Jacques Delors, it really emphasizes his view of tariffs as this wonder middle.
Yeah, wonder middle, like a miracle cure, almost.
A miracle cure for a whole host of economic and even geopolitical issues, apparently.
Yeah.
Can you expand on why he sees them that way?
Well, what's really insightful there isn't just that he sees tariffs as a powerful tool, but that he seems to believe they can tackle this remarkably broad range of seemingly unconnected problems.
Like what?
Well, he views them as a way to cut trade deficits, obviously, but also to push for, a separation from China, maintain the dollar's global dominance,
Wow.
and even use the sheer size of the U.S. market to influence other countries' policies on everything from defense spending to regulating big tech. It's a very interconnected view of how tariffs can reshape the global landscape.
That's a pretty sweeping vision for what a trade tool can achieve. And the Institute Jacques Delors also mentions some specific actions he might be considering, like a universal import duty.
Yes, and that's a real...
And it sounds like he might not necessarily need, full approval from Congress to implement some of these. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah. Both the Institute Jacques Delors and CSIS point to the considerable executive powers the U.S. president has.
Right.
He can invoke national security concerns, declare an economic emergency, take action against what he considers unfair trade practices. This means he could potentially bypass the usual legislative hoops and maybe even go against existing trade agreements.
It's interesting, though, that Institute Jacques Delors piece also touches on these internal debates within the U.S. administration about tariffs. Like, some see them as a good policy tool in themselves, others more as just leverage for negotiations.
That internal dynamic is definitely something to watch. I mean, appointing someone like Jamieson Greer as U.S. Trade Representative could suggest a more assertive stance, perhaps. But then potential nominations like Scott Bessent for Treasury Secretary or Howard Lutnick for Commerce Secretary, historically, they've maybe favored using tariffs more as a way to pressure countries into talks. So that might introduce a more moderating influence.
Maybe.
Maybe. But as the Institute Jacques Delors points out, even those who see tariffs primarily as a negotiating tactic might still be inclined to apply pretty significant pressure, especially on countries with large trade surpluses with the U.S.
And then there's the whole methodology behind these reciprocal tariffs that
Yeah.
CSIS gets into, it sounds. Well, maybe not entirely based on standard economics.
Well, what's fascinating and maybe a little flawed about their calculation is its simplicity.
How so?
The approach seems to basically focus on the ratio of the U.S. bilateral trade deficit in goods with a specific country compared to the total value of imports from that country.
Okay.
If there isn't a deficit in goods, maybe just a standard 10% tariff gets applied. But the problem, as CSIS clearly explains, is that this completely ignores the bigger economic picture, like the macroeconomic factors that actually drive trade balances, how much each country saves versus invests, for instance. And crucially, it totally overlooks trade and services.
Ah, right, where the U.S. often has a surplus, especially with the EU.
Exactly. So it's a very limited, maybe even misleading way to look at the whole trade relationship. For you, the listener, it means the justification for these potential tariffs might be based on a really incomplete picture.
Okay, so that's the U.S. perspective, or at least a big part of it. Now let's flip to the EU side. Watcher Guru mentions them pursuing a fair deal and this zero-for-zero tariff offer on industrial goods. What's the thinking there?
Well, the EU is clearly trying to find a path to de-escalate things, establish some common ground. This zero-for-zero offer on industrial goods, which, by the way, CSIS and the DHL timeline also mention as a long-standing idea for a bigger transatlantic free trade area, it shows they're willing to completely scrap tariffs in a major sector.
It's a diplomatic signal.
Exactly. It's aimed at showing their commitment to open trade and maybe convincing the U.S. that a mutually beneficial deal is still possible.
And that ECO analysis really highlights the EU's issue with this U.S. narrative just focusing on the goods imbalance, right?
Yes, absolutely. ECO makes the really important point that while the U.S. might hammer on about a goods deficit, the overall trade balance between the U.S. and the EU, when you actually include both goods and services, was only slightly in the EU's favor in 2023, like by about 3%.
So hardly a massive imbalance.
From the EU's perspective, yeah, the idea that there's this huge imbalance that justifies aggressive action seems like an exaggeration.
But it sounds like the EU's concerns go deeper than just arguing about the trade balance figures. ECO raises this really interesting point about the U.S. maybe trying to undermine the European Green Deal. Can you explain that?
This is a really crucial point of potential friction. ECO argues that a significant underlying objective of the U.S. administration might be to aggressively promote its exports of fossil fuels, particularly liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Europe.
Okay. How would that undermine the Green Deal?
Well, they suggest that by potentially pushing for, say, long-term purchase commitments for LNG, the U.S. could be trying to hinder Europe's own efforts to build energy independence and become more competitive in clean energy tech.
Which are central to the Green Deal.
Precisely. And the increasing role of renewables in Europe is already reducing its reliance on fossil fuels, including those from the U.S. This trend could be seen as a direct threat to American fossil fuel export interests. So, for you, the listener, what's really insightful here is seeing how trade policy can become a tool in a much larger geopolitical game intertwined with climate strategy.
Wow. Yeah, it's not just about tariffs on cars or cheese then. It's about shaping the future of energy and technology.
Definitely.
That adds a whole new layer of complexity. And what about the potential economic hit to the EU if the U.S. does impose significant tariffs? The Institute Jacques Delors had some estimates on that.
They do. The Institute Jacques Delors estimates that in a sort of worst-case scenario involving those broad 10 to 20% tariffs we talked about, the EU's GDP could potentially shrink by somewhere between, say, 0.5 and 1.0%.
That's not insignificant.
Not at all. And they also identify the sectors likely to be hit hardest: pharmaceuticals, chemicals, machinery, and vehicles. Interestingly, these are often sectors where the EU currently has a trade surplus with the U.S., as their analysis shows.
And I assume the impact wouldn't be spread evenly across all EU countries. Some would be more vulnerable.
Exactly right. The Institute Jacques Delors points out that countries like Ireland, Slovakia, Austria, Finland, Germany, Italy, Sweden, and Hungary seem particularly exposed.
Why them specifically?
Well, it's due to the significant chunk of their exports going to the U.S. relative to their overall GDP, and also the substantial trade surpluses they have with the U.S. And if tariffs specifically target the auto sector, then Germany, Slovakia, and Hungary would be especially affected.
But it wouldn't stop there, surely.
Oh no. Given how interconnected the European auto industry is, other member states would almost certainly feel significant indirect consequences too. It's a web.
The Institute Jacques Delors also mentions a potential sort of unintended consequence, this risk of trade diversion. If the U.S. puts high tariffs on goods from, say, China, could that actually create problems for the EU?
That's a very real concern, yeah. If the U.S. erects big trade barriers against Chinese goods, there's a strong possibility that those goods will just get diverted elsewhere. And the EU is a prime candidate market.
Meaning more competition for EU firms.
Exactly. It could lead to increased competition within the EU, particularly in sectors like machinery and electronics. The CSIS analysis raises this point too, noting U.S. tariffs on China could very well lead to a surge of Chinese exports flooding into the EU, putting real pressure on European manufacturers.
And that could get worse if China devalues its currency.
Potentially, yes. If China were to devalue its currency to try and maintain its export competitiveness, that would amplify the challenge. So, for you, our listener, it's not just about the direct EU-US tariffs. It's these potential knock-on effects rippling through the global economy in unexpected ways.
Okay, so the EU is potentially facing a multi-pronged challenge. Direct U.S. tariffs, maybe an attempt to undermine their Green Deal strategy, and increased competition from diverting trade. It sounds like they need a pretty robust response plan. The Institute Jacques Delors suggests they are in a better position to react this time compared to Trump's first term.
That's a key takeaway from their analysis, yes. They argue the EU has learned lessons from the first Trump administration and has now developed a stronger institutional framework and, importantly, a wider range of potential deterrent measures.
Okay, like what specifically? What kind of sticks and maybe some carrots are they considering?
All right, on the stick side, the Institute Jacques Delors mentions the EU has prepared potential retaliatory tariffs. They've kept the specifics a bit vague, probably for strategic reasons.
Makes sense.
They also highlight the increased importance of the EU enforcement regulation. This is especially critical now because the WTO's appellate body, the top court for trade disputes, it's basically non-functional.
Right, it's paralyzed.
Exactly. So there's no independent referee, which makes the EU's own enforcement tools much more vital. And the scope for retaliation has also been broadened to include services, which is significant given the U.S. surplus there.
What else is in the toolkit?
Other potential sticks include maybe using the foreign subsidies regulation in the ongoing Boeing dispute.
Ah, the Airbus-Boeing thing again?
And the international procurement instrument, which could leverage access to the EU's huge public procurement market. But perhaps the most significant development is the anti-coercion instrument, or ACI. Both Institute Jacques Delors and CSIS really emphasize this one.
Okay, ACI. What's special about that?
So for you listening, this ACI is basically a brand new tool in the EU's arsenal. It's specifically designed to push back against countries trying to strong-arm the EU on things like its climate policies, like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or its digital regulations.
So it's about protecting policy space, not just trade flows.
Precisely. And what's important is that activating the ACI only requires a qualified majority vote among EU member states. It makes it harder for one or two countries to block action. It shows a real shift in the EU's readiness to defend its corner.
That ACI does sound like a pretty significant upgrade to their trade defense. Okay, so those are the sticks. What about carrots? What could the EU potentially offer to maybe de-escalate things?
Well, the Institute Jacques Delors outlines a few possibilities. One is potentially increasing imports of LNG from the U.S.
But wait, doesn't that clash with the Green Deal concerns we just talked about?
It absolutely does. They acknowledge that inherent tension with long-term Green Deal goals and forecasts for falling gas demand, but the ongoing need to reduce reliance on Russian gas is still a major factor, so it's a complex calculation.
Right. Any other carrots?
Another potential one could be increasing defense procurement from the U.S., although, again, that needs balancing against the EU's own push for greater defense autonomy.
Tricky.
Very. They also mentioned the possibility of targeted cooperation on China. Maybe the EU might be willing to offer certain concessions in areas like critical infrastructure security or data transfer rules. It's interesting how these potential carrots often involve navigating these really complex trade-offs with other strategic goals.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balancing act on so many fronts.
Yeah.
And looking beyond just the immediate U.S. relationship, both Institute Jacques Delors and CSIS highlight how critical the EU's long-term strategy of diversifying its trade relationships is.
Definitely. I mean, the EU clearly recognizes the strategic need to reduce its over-reliance on any single big market. Successfully implementing the EU-Mercosur agreement, despite all the ratification challenges that's seen as a crucial test of their commitment to diversification.
And they're talking to others, too.
Oh, yeah. Ongoing trade negotiations with key partners like Australia, the ASEAN bloc, India, those are all vital. Plus, efforts to smooth things over and reduce trade barriers with existing close partners like the UK, Switzerland, and Turkey are also part of this broader strategy.
And didn't Business Matters have a point about UK opinion?
Yes, interestingly, they pointed out that public opinion in the UK actually seems to favor stronger trade ties with the EU over a big comprehensive deal with the US right now, which just adds another interesting layer to the whole European trade picture.
So it's not just about looking east or west, but also closer to home.
Exactly. And it's worth remembering, too, as we touched on, the EU has previously proposed completely eliminating tariffs on U.S. industrial goods. That old idea of a big transatlantic free trade area keeps popping up.
So it really is a mix. Immediate tactical responses, potential concessions to maybe ease tensions, and this longer-term strategic vision of, well, not putting all their eggs in one basket.
That sums it up pretty well.
And finally, that DTCO analysis brings us back to the geopolitical dimension, really underscoring this apparent U.S. aim to stop Europe getting too reliant on China, especially for crucial clean energy tech.
Yes, ECCO makes that compelling argument. While the LNG discussion is important, maybe a primary underlying U.S. objective is preventing Europe from deepening its dependence on China for the technologies essential for the green transition.
And Italy might have a particular role.
Potentially.
Cool.
ECCO notes Italy's position, given its energy needs and its recent economic support package, could give it a specific role in negotiations. But the central message from the EE side, as ECCO emphasizes, is that the Green Deal isn't just about climate change.
Right.
It's fundamentally tied to Europe's long-term security, its energy independence, and its overall economic competitiveness.
Okay, so to really bring it all together for you, our listener, it seems clear that the trade relationship between the EU and the U.S. is at a truly critical juncture right now. We're seeing active negotiations happening, literally, alongside this very real threat of escalating tariffs. The decisions made in the coming months, they're going to have pretty significant economic and geopolitical consequences that will definitely extend far beyond just Brussels and Washington.
That's absolutely right. There are just so many interconnected factors at play here. You've got the domestic political scenes in both the U.S. and the EU, these differing fundamental economic priorities. You know, the U.S. focus on the goods trade balance versus the EU's deep commitment to the Green Deal.
Right.
And then the whole broader global context, especially the massive and growing role of China in trade and technology. It's just a deeply complex, highly interconnected situation with potentially really far-reaching consequences.
Which kind of brings us to our final thought for you to consider. Given these inherent tensions we've discussed between short-term trade deals, often driven by political cycles, and these longer-term strategic goals of building genuine economic resilience and sustainability, how might the whole global trade landscape be fundamentally reshaped in the coming years?
That's the big question.
Yeah. What role can individual nations and major economic blocs like the EU realistically play in navigating this constantly evolving environment? Think about that crucial balance between maybe seeking immediate economic gains and ensuring long-term strategic positioning in a world that is increasingly defined by complex interdependencies and, let's face it, competing priorities.
Lots to chew on there.
Definitely. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.